But first tonight, confirmation the Voice to Parliament referendum will be politically divided, which history suggests could doom it to fail. The Federal Liberal Party has voted to formally oppose the government's Voice to Parliament model. Liberal leader Peter Dutton made the announcement following a party room meeting this afternoon.
The Liberal Party resolved today to say yes to constitutional recognition for Indigenous Australians, yes to a local and regional body so that we can get practical outcomes for Indigenous people on the ground. But there was a resounding no to the Prime Minister's Canberra Voice. We want to make sure that we can get the best possible outcomes for Indigenous Australians, and we do that through recognising Indigenous Australians in the Constitution and by providing for their say, their voice to be heard by government in a very clear way, but at a local level. Having a Canberra Voice is not going to resolve the issues on the ground in Indigenous communities.
But the Minister for Indigenous Australians, Linda Burney, says this decision shows the Liberal Party just is not listening.
Today's decision is about Liberal Party internals. It has nothing to do with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people or taking Australia forward together. The referendum later this year is about two things. It's about recognition and it's about listening. And the Australian people will decide this referendum, not politicians.
Shadow ministers will be bound to support the Liberal Party position, but backbenchers will not. Federal Liberal MP Bridget Archer has already made it clear that she will cross the floor and support the government.
I will be 100% supporting a yes campaign going forward, and I'm disappointed. For me, there is a moral imperative at this point to support this campaign. We're going to have a referendum. The Australian people should ultimately have their say, and my view would be the best thing that the Liberal Party could have done at this point would just be to get out of the way.
And of course, this all comes after coalition partners the Nationals declared in November last year that they would not support the Voice model either. Well, for more, we're joined by the ABC's Voice correspondent and Drum co-host Dan Borcher, who's with us from Fitzroy Crossing in Western Australia. Dan, can you explain Peter Dutton and this model that he's come with? He seems to be saying yes to a bunch of things that he's not being asked about and no to the one thing that he is being asked about.
Well, that's certainly what it appears like, John. Good evening from here on Bunuba country in Fitzroy Crossing, where we know that from that news conference today that the opposition leader is saying yes to enshrining recognition of First Nations people in the Constitution, yes to local and regional voices, which was one of the key tenets of the Karma Langton report that came out during the former Liberal government, but no to this crucial question about a voice to Parliament. And then we also heard from Susan Lee, the Deputy Opposition Leader, said that today is not a no from the Liberal Party, and you'd have to think that this is in some way about the politics that we've heard the Prime Minister repeatedly referring to the opposition as the coalition in the Parliament, for which he's been reprimanded at occasions by the Speaker. But today really seemed to be a turning point in this entire discussion, laying on the line what the Liberals' position would be, and as you mentioned there, certainly in line with that position taken by the Nationals late last year.
So, Dan, this idea of constitutional recognition, it seems to be, and Peter Dutton wasn't entirely clear on this during his press conference this afternoon, that recognition would be of Indigenous people as First Australians, rather like the preamble that was being discussed during the Abbott years, and even back to the second question on the Republic referendum in 1999, which acknowledged that as well. But it seems to stop there. It doesn't enshrine any kind of national voice.
Yeah, that's exactly the point here, is that there is a sense of vagueness about what exactly the opposition is now supporting. John, it's got to be noted, though, that in those consultations where around 1,200 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people met at those summits across the nation, culminating in Uluru, where we saw the Uluru Statement from the Heart, symbolic recognition and enshrinement, as is now seems to be being called for by the opposition, that was roundly rejected by those Indigenous people that gathered, that were from grassroots communities across the nation. They say that, or they said in fact, that it needed to be more than just symbolic, that it had to be able to have an outcome as well. And that's exactly the point that the opposition leader today says, that this voice, the Canberra voice, in fact, is what he referred to it in that grab and in that news conference that we heard, that this won't lead to practical outcomes on the ground. And certainly that's what we've been hearing from Jacinta Nampijinpa-Price, a senator with the Nationals, who says that this will just be another layer of bureaucracy and won't lead to any substantive change in the places where it's most needed in Australia.
Dan, of course, supporters of the Yes case, including Prime Minister Albanese, they know enough about history to know that no referendum is passed without bipartisan support. 4 out of 5 referendum questions go down in any event. So this is a big ask. What has been the Prime Minister's response?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. We know that Australians are reluctant to change our founding document, the Constitution. 8 out of 44 have passed. In fact, the most successful was the 1967 referendum that also related to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people at a whopping 90.77%. There's been a lot of questions already about whether the government thinks that this will be able to pass without bipartisan support. The point has been made before that given the two-pronged test that referendums pass or fail by a majority of people and a majority of states, that it's actually the premiers and chief ministers that might hold a bigger role here. And certainly those that have been campaigning for the Yes side say that we don't know, because we haven't seen a referendum in the age of social media, the last one almost 25 years ago. So whether or not bipartisanship plays a big role remains to be seen. We've heard from the Prime Minister speaking on ABC Sydney just recently, and he said that he was very sad to hear this position from the opposition, although he noted that anyone who's been following this won't necessarily be surprised. He also said that from the ground up, this was a campaign that came from the community, and the Prime Minister saying that it was pretty inadequate to hear from the opposition that this was about a Canberra voice, that it lacked substance as well, really going to the point of whether this was politics, which we heard from the Prime Minister and also the Minister for Indigenous Australians, Linda Burney. They were both saying that this appeared to be about internals within the Liberal Party and then about politics more broadly. That, of course, we are going to hear more about that because Bridget Archer and others are already speaking out about this.
Yeah, stay with us, Dan. On that point, David Cross, can you explain those political calculations within the Liberal Party room and essentially what are the pressures that they are responding to that has seen both coalition parties reach this decision?
I think the pressures they're responding to is that of the quite loud but quite reactionary right. And I think that is amplified in Canberra. I think at state levels you tend not to see the amplification as much, but I think the voices of the kind of usual suspects on After Dark shows and of certain colourful individuals within the party room are pretty amplified there. And I think what you've seen here is a pandering to that position. I think the thing that really concerns me is, so there's 2 things I'll say on this. The first is that I don't believe that a lot of these people in the party room under any circumstance want to support this. And so what they've done is they've dressed in a deep-seated, almost emotional opposition to this in this thin veneer of reasonableness, of identifying and cherry-picking concerns that general people in the community who may support the voice, but they still might have questions about how it's going to work. They've kind of identified those soft spots. They've put it as a dressing around a kind of ideological opposition to it, and then they've presented that as the reasons as to why they're going to oppose it. So I think very rightly it's been fantastic to see people like Bridget Archer cross the floor. I know there's going to be others. The second thing I'll say is because that's the strategy that the coalition have taken here, I think they sense it as a pathway to win. I think they sense a weakness in the Yes campaign, which to date has been properly explaining exactly how this is going to work. They sense a bit of a Brexit moment here, where even though the general vibe in the community is one that is broadly supportive of this, there's I think a general agreement that reconciliation is a good thing. There are 1 or 2 issues that people have identified, the fact that it can make independent representations to the executive as being one of them that the Liberal Party's identified, but there's a range of others, and I think they think by drilling into that and by painting the Yes campaign as something that's kind of opaque and not transparent, they can kind of sniff a pathway to victory there for the right. But I think it's calculated. I think it's political, and I think the reasons, while seemingly reasonable, they've chosen to put in front of why they've opposed it. If that was what Labor was proposing, I still don't think these voices would support it.
Tanya Hosch, what do you make of today's decision, and do you think that there is a way for Yes campaigners to remove the politics from this, and a little bit like the marriage equality plebiscite, make this about the people it affects rather than the politics that swirls around it?
Well, that's absolutely the challenge, and I agree with other sentiments expressed since the Liberal Party announced their position today. It is really sad. It's incredibly disappointing that after over a decade's work, moving through processes, consultations, research, ongoing debate and exploration of this issue, at great lengths and depth, that they would come out and say no. But I think the good news is that they've got time to change their mind. That's the first thing, and I hope that more and more people over the course of this period do choose to support the voice. But we also need to stick to the facts here. I think it is misleading to suggest it is a Canberra voice. The very essence of the voice is that it will be made up of people who represent local regions coming together, being elected by other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who they share their communities with, to give those representations. One of the other things that we know through research, both internationally and domestically, is that when Indigenous people have opportunities to have input into decisions that affect them, they make very worthy representations in those matters, because after all, they're the people that most keenly feel the consequences of that decision making.
Yeah.
So I think to present it as a Canberra voice is actually really misleading, because the truth is it will be made up of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who've been elected by their own communities from across Australia.
Yeah. Phil Williams, what do you make of the polling that we're seeing around this? The news poll today suggests that if a referendum had been held in February or March, the yes case would win. There would be a majority of votes in the majority of states. But it also showed, because they need 4 of the 6 states to say yes in all of this, that Western Australia and Tasmania, if not on a knife edge, are certainly gettable, just based on the undecided vote.
Yes, and this is the problem with the Coalition's position, is that could actually tip the balance. This could mean that the voice to Parliament is not enacted, and the constitutional change does not go through, and an opportunity, once in many generations, perhaps you could argue for 220 odd years, is missed. And I think that would weigh very heavily, you would hope, on the consciences of those that have been involved in this decision today. One thing that also really strikes me is this idea of the regional consultation. That's okay. We'll talk to you in Dubbo, we'll talk to you in Colac, but we won't talk to you in Canberra. It just seems bizarre to me, in a sense that if you had major policies on housing, for example, would you only talk to the builders in Dubbo or Colac or Longreach, and not talk to the master builders in Canberra? It just doesn't seem logical. After all, the voice is about consulting about issues that affect Aboriginal Australians. And if you're not talking to them in Canberra and you're only talking to them in the regions, how do you collectively know what the sum total of those views are, and how legitimate are those views if they're taken in isolation?
Angela, do you see this as simply a contest for the undecided, those that have yet to fix an opinion, or because sometimes there's a real rusted on effect with people, and they do make up their minds quite early?
Oh, look, I think it's still there, to be won. So, we're obviously going to hold this referendum in November, and there is still a big conversation that the Australian public are going to have. There are still people out there who don't know a lot about what the voice represents and what it is going to mean. And to those people, I do encourage them to read the Uluru Statement from the Heart as a first point. It won't take you very long. It's literally a 2 or 3 minute read, but it really is the invitation from which this referendum is based. I think today is going to be seen, I think it's pretty meaningless, to be honest with you. It was an interesting ploy. I could say quite dishonest, to be fair. I think when you look at what the detail of what they're throwing up, they're obviously trying to, make things messy and difficult for people to understand. But look, I do think that what we are seeing across the Australian community is a lot of goodwill in terms of responding to this invitation that is represented by this referendum to provide recognition to our First Nations people and our Constitution. It's pretty simple, and to provide a mechanism for them to have a voice to our Parliament and to our Executive. And look, it was a sad day today, and it was a sad day last week when the opposition didn't turn up to Parliament, and the lack of respect was, it was really disappointing. And I think really what we will do from here is, I think, gather, I don't want to say forget what happened today, but move forward as a country and come together around this, because it is really important, I think, for us as a nation as we move forward.
Let's briefly go back to Fitzroy Crossings. Dan Borcher, Angela talks there about moving forward from here. What is the path forward? Because there's still a parliamentary process to go through. And what impact does the Liberal Party's decision today have on their involvement in those votes and committees and so on that happen from now?
Well, that's going to be very interesting to watch, John, because, of course, that's a process that is unfolding now after that legislation was tabled last week. We're expecting a report back from either the committee as a whole, or perhaps there will be a committee report and then dissenting reports if, in fact, the view from the opposition that we heard today finds its way into that committee position as well. And then we're likely to see those come through sometime next month in May, likely around or after the budget, and then the government is hoping that legislation will then be able to be passed in the middle of the year, because of course when that constitutional alteration bill passes, that's really what gives then the government the trigger to reach into the final stretches of the campaign and then to set a date. As for now, though, we've heard Professor Megan Davis and others saying that the campaign will be really focused on grassroots, getting out into the community. In fact, the launch that I covered in Adelaide just a couple of weeks of the Yes campaign a couple of weeks ago was really starting to prepare those campaigners for what was ahead. When I was speaking to Warren Mundine on that, now infamous session of the Drum a couple of weeks ago, he was also saying that the No campaigners were starting to rally and that there was a whole process happening leading out to No campaigners really hitting the streets. So what we're going to now see is the political process on one hand, and then very much a community process on the other. And I think with politics, it's always interesting, the optics, isn't it? Is that we just heard about the opposition not attending the tabling of that legislation last week. We were told by the opposition leader's office that there was another engagement on a meeting at that time. Well, just this afternoon, we've heard from Marcus Stewart, who's on the referendum working group, who said on Twitter, walked out of the apology and now walked out on the Voice. So you get the sense that there will be some campaigners that will certainly be latching on to this as part of the campaign message in the weeks and months ahead, John. OK. Well, we'll see you back here soon, Dan. Thanks for joining us tonight. Dan Borcher, the ABC's Voice correspondent and Drum host.